February 28th, 2026, 2:30 in the morning. Most of the world was asleep. Children in Tehran were in their beds. A mother in Mashhad was folding laundry. A student in Isfahan was studying for exams he would never take. And then, the sky turned white. Operation Epic Fury had begun. In the span of hours, Supreme Leader Khamenei, a man who had ruled Iran for 35 years, was gone. Nuclear sites, missile facilities, naval command, military intelligence, all of it erased in a single night. The United States and Israel didn't just attack a country. They tried to kill a civilization's power structure in one surgical move. But here is what I need you to understand, because this is a psychology channel, and we don't just watch history. We decode it. This war was not a reaction. It was not spontaneous. It was not about a sudden nuclear threat. The Defense Intelligence Agency itself said Iran was at least a decade away from a missile that could reach America. This war was the conclusion of a plan that was being written for 30 years, in the minds of two very specific men. And when you understand the psychology of those men, you realize that the bombs that fell on Tehran were almost inevitable. Today, we are going to go inside that psychology. We're going to follow the decades-long obsession that turned into policy. We're going to decode the manipulation, the fear, and the identity that drove two of the most powerful leaders on earth to do what every diplomat, every intelligence analyst, every economist said not to do. And by the end of this video, you will see this war completely differently. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn is not in the news. It lives in the mind. Before we go any further, if you're new here, this channel is called Quiet Power. We believe that understanding the hidden psychology behind world events is one of the most powerful things a thinking person can do. Subscribe right now. Turn on notifications, because after today, your feed will never look the same. Let me take you back to 1996. Benjamin Netanyahu was standing at the podium of the United States Congress. He was 46 years old. He was lean, sharp-eyed, and utterly convinced of one thing. Iran was about to get a nuclear bomb, and the world was running out of time to stop them. He said it then. He said it in 2002. He said it in 2009. He said it in 2012, famously holding up a cartoon drawing of a bomb at the United Nations and pointing to a red line that the world refused to cross. He said it in 2015. He said it in 2023. He has been delivering the same speech with absolute, unwavering consistency for 30 years. Now ask yourself a psychological question. What does it do to a person's mind, to their identity, to spend 30 years warning the world about a threat and watching the world not act? What happens to conviction when it hardens over 3 decades into something that is no longer just a political position, but a core part of who you are? In psychology, we call this identity-fused belief. It is a concept studied extensively in the context of political extremism and committed leadership. When a belief becomes fused with a person's identity, when being the man who warned about Iran becomes inseparable from being Benjamin Netanyahu, the psychological cost of abandoning or moderating that belief becomes existential. It is not just losing an argument. It feels like losing yourself. And there is something else. Psychologists who study leaders with long-term obsessive threat perception often find a phenomenon called threat inflation. Over years and decades, the perceived danger becomes larger in the mind than the evidence can support, because the mind, under sustained pressure, amplifies threats that confirm its core narrative. Netanyahu had seen Iran fund Hezbollah missiles that killed Israeli citizens. He had watched Iran's proxies surround Israel from Gaza to Lebanon to Syria to Yemen. He had watched Iran's leaders chant death to Israel for decades. To him, these were not geopolitical disagreements. They were existential proof. And then, in late 2025, something shifted. something that Netanyahu had never quite encountered before. Trump, his greatest ally, was beginning to negotiate. Iran nuclear talks were progressing through Oman. A deal was forming. A deal that would have kept Iran's nuclear program limited, but would have also kept the Islamic Republic alive, stable, recognized, powerful in the region. For Netanyahu, this was unacceptable, not because of the specific terms of the deal, but because of what the deal would mean, psychologically and strategically. A surviving Iran with any diplomatic standing meant that 30 years of warning had produced compromise. It meant the regime he had dedicated his career to opposing would live. It meant that his entire identity as the sentinel of Israel's security would need to be recalibrated. According to analysts who have tracked Netanyahu's agenda for decades, his core objective has always been to prevent a diplomatic solution from legitimizing Iran. When he learned that Trump was actually serious about getting a deal, he acted. Just as he had done in June 2025, launching strikes in the middle of negotiations. He did it again in February 2026. Except this time, he brought the full weight of American military power with him. 30 years, one man, one conviction, and a world that finally gave him what he had always demanded. Not because the threat changed, but because the psychology of those in power finally aligned. That is Chapter 1. One man's obsession became a nation's foreign policy. But Netanyahu could not have done this alone. To understand the other half of this equation, you need to understand a completely different kind of psychology. One built not on conviction, but on something far more volatile, the fear of humiliation. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu are psychologically almost opposite personalities, and yet, in this moment, they arrived at the same conclusion from completely different directions. Understanding Trump's psychology requires us to enter a framework that political psychologists have written about extensively, the psychology of dominance-based identity. Trump's self-concept, the story he tells about who he is built entirely on a foundation of strength, winning, and the absolute refusal to appear weak. His political brand was constructed around the idea that where other presidents failed, he succeeds. Where Obama drew red lines and retreated, Trump would hold firm. Where Bush created endless wars with no resolution, Trump would be decisive and conclusive. He came into office calling himself the president of peace and genuinely believed he could end conflicts through sheer force of personality and leverage. But Iran had become a psychological problem for Trump, a problem of face. In January 2026, as Iranian security forces massacred protesters in the streets, protesters who were dying while chanting for freedom, Trump posted "Help is on its way" on Truth Social. He positioned himself as their savior. He drew a moral line in public, and then he held back from striking. He ordered a military buildup in the Middle East instead. That pause was psychologically costly, because in Trump's mental model, hesitation looks like weakness. And weakness, in his psychology, is the one thing that cannot be tolerated. Not because he is reckless, but because his entire self-narrative depends on the perception of invincibility. And then there was the nuclear question. By February 2026, Trump had made numerous public statements that Iran was developing missiles capable of reaching American cities. These claims, it must be noted, were contradicted by the Defense Intelligence Agency, by European intelligence services, and by international weapons monitoring groups. Iran's nuclear program had been set back by 2 years, following the June 2025 strikes. The threat was real, but not imminent. The urgency was constructed. And when a leader repeatedly states a threat publicly, something critical happens in their psychology. They begin to believe their own framing. Psychologists call this belief perseverance, the tendency for people to maintain their beliefs even when presented with contradictory evidence, especially when those beliefs have been publicly committed to. Trump had said in multiple speeches that Iran will never get a nuclear weapon. Not probably won't. Not we are working on it. Never. That absolute public commitment created a psychological trap. Any deal that allowed Iran to maintain even limited enrichment would have meant Trump's words were hollow. And then came the IAEA report on February 27, 2026, the day before the strikes. The International Atomic Energy Agency reported that Iran had concealed highly enriched uranium in an underground facility untouched by previous strikes. That single report, whatever its actual strategic significance, became the psychological permission slip, the justification that made action feel not just possible, but necessary, not just political, but righteous. This is a pattern well documented in conflict psychology. Leaders under pressure often wait for, and sometimes unconsciously create, a triggering event that transforms a strategic decision into a moral imperative. The IAEA report gave Trump what he needed, not a reason to strike. He already had those. It gave him a story in which he was not the aggressor, but the defender. Not the one starting a war, but the one ending a threat. And so, on the night of February 28th, he sat in the Situation Room at Mar-a-Lago, surrounded by advisors watching the strikes unfold in real time. And he did what he had been psychologically building toward for years. He chose decisiveness over diplomacy. He chose legacy over negotiation. He chose the version of himself that his own mind demands he be. Netanyahu's psychology was identity. Trump's psychology was dominance. Two very different engines, pulling the same vehicle toward the same destination. But there is a third psychological force at work in this story. One that is older, deeper, and perhaps more terrifying than either individual leader's mind. It is the psychology of what happens when a conspiracy, a plan, is built over years, in secret, until the plan itself becomes larger and more powerful than any single person inside it. Here is something that should stop you in your tracks. In the weeks before Operation Epic Fury, while Iran and the United States were engaged in indirect nuclear negotiations mediated through Oman, while a second round of talks had been scheduled in Geneva, while diplomacy was by all observable measures working, the Mossad director visited Washington, D.C., twice in secret. He was followed by the Israeli military intelligence chief, then the IDF chief of staff, all of them meeting with American counterparts, all of them coordinating a joint operation that the public knew nothing about. This was not improvisation. This was not a reaction to an emergency. This was a plan that had been building since at least October 2025, when Netanyahu sat with Trump, and they discussed a follow-up operation to the June 2025 strikes, initially planned for around May 2026. What changed the timeline was not the nuclear threat. What changed the timeline was the Iranian protest movement, largest since the 1979 revolution, and the regime's brutal response, which killed thousands of civilians and created a window of international moral outrage that could be used to legitimize action. To understand the psychology of conspiracy, not in the pejorative sense, but in the technical sense of coordinated secret planning toward a shared goal, you need to understand what psychologists and organizational researchers call collective intentionality. This is the process by which multiple actors, over time, align their individual motivations, resources, and actions into a unified direction without any single central command. The result is an outcome that no single actor planned alone, but that all of them were individually moving toward. For Netanyahu, the endgame was always the elimination of Iran as a regional power. For Trump, it was the validation of his hawkish Iran policy and the securing of a historical legacy. For Israeli security chiefs, who had watched Iran rebuild its proxy networks since the 2025 war, it was strategic necessity. For Gulf state leaders who privately welcomed American action against Iran, it was an opportunity they had been encouraging for years. All of these motivations, all of these psychological needs, all of these strategic calculations were flowing in the same direction simultaneously. And the remarkable thing about collective intentionality is this: at a certain point, the plan develops its own gravity. Withdrawal becomes psychologically and politically impossible for any individual actor. The costs of stopping exceed the costs of continuing. And so the plan moves, not because any single person orders it forward, but because the entire system has been designed to move, and no individual has both the will and the power to stop it. There is a concept in social psychology called pluralistic ignorance, where each member of a group privately doubts a course of action, but assumes that everyone else is fully committed, and therefore says nothing. Multiple accounts from inside the Trump administration suggest that some officials had deep reservations about the strikes. The American public, in polling conducted days before the operation, opposed military action against Iran by a significant margin. Even some within Israel's security establishment privately questioned the timing. And yet, the plan proceeded. Because in the room where decisions are made, no one spoke against it with enough conviction to stop what had already become inevitable in the minds of those who held the power. And then there was the masterstroke, the psychological framing of the operation itself. Trump did not call it a declaration of war. He called it defense. He did not say, "We are attacking Iran." He said, "We are defending the American people." He addressed the Iranian people directly. "The hour of your freedom is at hand," positioning the bombardment of their country as liberation. Netanyahu used the same framing: cast off the yoke of tyranny. This is what psychologists call moral licensing, the use of a righteous narrative to make an action that would otherwise feel wrong feel not just acceptable, but heroic. The conspiracy was not a secret room with a whiteboard and a plan labeled "Destroy Iran." It was far more psychologically sophisticated than that. It was two men with complementary obsessions, supported by allies with aligned interests, waiting for a political window that their own actions helped to create using a crisis they did not start, but chose not to stop, to do what all of them had individually wanted for decades. That is the architecture of this war. Identity, dominance, and collective gravity, all converging on a single night in February 2026. But we have not yet asked the most important question, the question that no one in power seems to be asking. What happens to the people caught inside this psychology? What happens to the 90 million Iranians who are not in any room, not part of any plan, and had no say in any of this? Let me tell you something that Trump and Netanyahu both said, almost word for word, on the same night. Trump told the Iranian people, "When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations." Netanyahu said, "Cast off the yoke of tyranny and bring about a free and peaceful Iran." On the surface, this sounds like liberation. But there is a concept in political psychology called externally triggered uprising theory, and decades of research on it leads to a single, uncomfortable conclusion. It almost never works the way the external actors believe it will. And the reason why is rooted in something deeply human, something that has nothing to do with politics or ideology. When a country is bombed from the outside, even a population that despises its government, and a significant portion of Iranians did, despise the Islamic Republic, as evidenced by the massive 2025-2026 protests that swept over 100 cities, experiences a powerful and well-documented psychological shift. Psychologists call it the rally around the flag effect. External threat activates in-group solidarity. The common enemy becomes not the regime, but the bomber. The emotional calculus transforms from "I hate my government" to "my home is under attack, and I must survive." This is not ideology. It is not loyalty to Khomeini or any particular regime. It is something far more primal, the survival instinct of collective identity under existential threat. And research from Bosnia, from Iraq, from Libya, from Afghanistan, countries where external military action was intended to produce popular uprising, consistently shows the same pattern. The bombs create short-term fragmentation, but medium-term national cohesion. The regime may be weakened militarily, but the opposition is also traumatized, displaced, and stripped of its moral high ground when its liberation arrives, wrapped in missiles fired from the outside. And yet, the Iranian people's story in 2026 is not simple, and it would be a psychological distortion to tell it simply. Because they were already suffering catastrophically before the first bomb fell. By late 2025, the collapse of Ayande Bank had triggered a financial crisis that sent the rial into near worthlessness. Inflation was devastating ordinary households. At least 5 more major banks were on the edge of collapse. The regime's response to the protest movement, in which thousands were killed, including in what human rights organizations described as deliberate massacres of unarmed civilians, had broken something deep and perhaps irreparable in the social contract between the Iranian government and its people. These were not people who needed to be told they lived under tyranny. They knew. They had been dying in the streets to prove it. The protests that erupted in late 2025 were driven by people who had nothing left to lose, and who had found each other in numbers large enough to feel, for the first time in decades, that change was genuinely possible. And then, in the middle of that awakening, in the middle of that fragile and extraordinary moment of collective courage, the bombs fell. And the moment of potential transformation from within became something else entirely. A moment of survival against forces from without. Here is the tragedy that psychology illuminates with painful clarity. The people with the most legitimate reason to want change in Iran were the ones most harmed by the method chosen to create that change. The protest movement that had genuinely threatened the regime's stability was interrupted, not completed, by external military action. The regime, which had been economically collapsing and socially fracturing under its own weight, was handed the one thing it desperately needed: an external enemy. A reason for the country to hold together through fear, rather than fall apart through its own accumulated failures. History will determine whether Operation Epic Fury succeeded in its stated military objectives. Analysts remain divided. Some argue the Islamic Republic's structure was too damaged, its finances too depleted, its leadership too decimated to survive in any recognizable form. Others argue that the Iranian state was built specifically to absorb external shocks, that the IRGC remains partially intact, and that what comes next will be far longer and far bloodier than anyone in those planning rooms was willing to say out loud. But what history cannot afford to miss, and what a psychology channel must name clearly and without flinching, is the human cost. Not the strategic cost, not the geopolitical cost, the human psychological cost, paid not by leaders in secure rooms, not by generals watching battle maps glow with successful strike confirmations, but by a mother in Mashhad who was folding laundry when the sky turned white, by the student in Isfahan whose exams were canceled, not because the regime had finally fallen, but because the bombs fell first, by the protest movement that had gathered years of courage and finally found its voice, and then watched that voice become irrelevant when the home narrative of their liberation was taken from them by people who had never asked what they actually wanted. That is who pays the price when identity and dominance and collective conspiracy converge into war. Not the men in the room, not the men at the podiums, the ones who never got to choose. And perhaps that is the most important psychological truth of all, and the one that history repeats most faithfully. Wars are rarely started by the people who fight them. They are started by people whose minds made the outcome feel inevitable, long before a single bomb was ever dropped. I want to ask you something before you leave. Not a political question, but a psychological one. Think about the last time you made a decision, a real one, a significant one, and told yourself it was rational. told yourself it was based on evidence, on logic, on what was clearly right. And then later, you realized how much of it was actually about identity, about the story you needed to protect about who you are, about the version of yourself you couldn't afford to abandon. We all do this. Leaders do it at the scale of nations. And that is precisely why understanding psychology, truly understanding it, not as a self-help exercise, but as a lens on power and reality, is one of the most important things a thinking person can do in the world we are living in. If this video gave you something to think about, if it shifted even slightly how you see this war, or any conflict, or any leader, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it will change a policy, but because the most dangerous force in geopolitics is an uninformed and psychologically illiterate public. And the most quietly subversive thing you can do in any era is understand what is actually happening beneath the surface of what you are being told. Subscribe to Quiet Power. This is what we do here every single week. We go beneath the surface of what the world is telling you, and we show you the psychology underneath it. The quiet forces that move history. The ones that no press conference, no headline, no official statement will ever name. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. I want to know which of these three psychological forces you believe was the most powerful driver of this war. Netanyahu's 30-year identity obsession, Trump's dominant psychology and fear of humiliation, or the collective gravity of a conspiracy that became too large for any single person to stop. Until the next one, think clearly, see deeply, and remember, power is almost never what it appears to be on the surface.